There are criminals and then there are legends. The kind of men whose names don't just appear in police files, they echo through time. Whispered in bank vaults, carved into headlines, romanticized, and completely violently real. Tonight's story is about one of those men, a charming outlaw, a ruthless bank robber, a man who smiled for the cameras while leaving bodies behind him. A man who became the force of crime in America during the darkest years of the Great Depression. This is the story of John Dillinger. Welcome back to Meals to Unalive For. I'm Jody Breton, and this is where food and memory meet, and not everything stays in the past. Today, we'll be making Salisbury steak, mashed potatoes, green beans, apple pie cookies, and hand pies. Before he was public enemy number one, before the headlines, the manhunts, the shootouts, John Dillinger was just a boy. He was born on June 22, 1903, in Indianapolis at a modest home on Cooper Street, the younger of two children, and from the very beginning, his life was shaped by loss. His mother, Mary Ellen, who went by Molly, died in 1907. He wasn't even 4 years old. That kind of loss, that early, it doesn't just disappear, it lingers. It changes the way a child understands the world, who's safe, who stays, and who doesn't. After her death, Dillinger was largely cared for by his older sister Audrey. She had just gotten married herself, starting a life of her own, and yet she stepped in to help raise her little brother. For a while, she became that sense of stability, but even that wouldn't last forever. In 1912, their father remarried a woman named Elizabeth Lizzie, and suddenly the household grew again. More children, more structure, more pressure. John Dillinger's father, John Wilson Dillinger, was a grocer by trade, but at home he was known for being strict, sometimes harsh. The kind of man who believed discipline wasn't just necessary, it was everything. Dillinger would later say his father lived by the idea, spare the rod, spoil the child, and he meant it. There's something about that combination, early loss, rigid discipline, and a household that keeps changing shape. It doesn't excuse what comes later, but it does start to explain it. Because long before Dillinger learned how to rob banks, he learned how to survive in a world that didn't feel stable. And sometimes that's where the story really begins. As John Dillinger grew older, it became clear that whatever instability marked his childhood was starting to show in more visible ways. As a teenager, he wasn't just a little rebellious. He was known for fighting, for petty theft, for pushing boundaries just to see how far they'd been before breaking. And there was something else people noticed about him, something harder to define. They described it as bewildering personality. Charming one moment, aggressive the next. The kind of person you couldn't quite predict and maybe couldn't fully trust. He bullied smaller kids, got into trouble often enough that it stopped being surprising, and eventually, school just ended. Not with a big decision, not with a plan. He dropped out and went to work in a machine shop in Indianapolis. By this point, his father was desperate, convinced the city itself was the problem, that Indianapolis was corrupting his son. He made a decision. In 1921, he uprooted the entire family and moved them to a small town in Mooresville, a quieter place, more rural, the kind of town where nothing much happens. The hope, a fresh start. But here's the thing about running from problems. If the problem is already inside the person, it follows you. Even in Mooresville, Dillinger didn't settle down. He didn't straighten out. If anything, the same patterns just kept repeating. In 1922, he was arrested for auto theft, and whatever fragile relationship he still had with his father started to crack even further. At this point, something had to give, and for Dillinger, that something came in the form of an escape. In 1923, trying to outrun his reputation, or maybe just himself, Dillinger enlisted in the United States Navy. For a moment, it looked like structure might finally stick. He was assigned to a machinery repairman aboard the battleship of the USS Utah. A steady role, a clear purpose, rules, order, discipline, everything his life had been missing. And yet, it didn't last. Just a few months into his service while docked in Boston, Dillinger deserted. No warning, he just simply left. Eventually, he was caught and discharged from the Navy dishonorably. Another door closed, another chance gone. By now, the pattern was undeniable. Authority didn't hold him, structure didn't change him, and the consequences, they didn't stop him. They were just leading him somewhere. After everything, the fighting, the arrest, the Navy, John Dillinger went back to Mooresville, and for a moment it looked like maybe, just maybe, he was going to choose a different life. That's where he met Beryl Ethel Hovius. She wasn't part of the chaos, she wasn't part of his past. She was stability. The two married on April 12th, 1924, and for a brief moment it seemed like Dillinger was trying to become someone else. A husband, a working man, a person with something to lose. But wanting a different life and being able to build one, those are two very different things. Dillinger struggled. Finding steady work wasn't easy. Holding on to it was even harder. And that pressure, the financial strain, the frustration, and feeling of being stuck, it started to build until eventually he turned back to what he already knew. He reached out to an old friend, Ed Singleton, an ex convict. Not exactly the kind of person you call when you're trying to stay on the right path. Together, they made a plan. It wasn't a bank, it wasn't elaborate. It was a small grocery store in Mooresville. They just walked in and stole $50, which is equivalent to about $965 today. That's it, $50. But it wasn't the amount that mattered, it was what happened inside. During the robbery, Dillinger struck a man on the head with a machine bolt wrapped in cloth. He carried a gun, and at that point, it just discharged. No one was hit, but that didn't make it harmless. Violence had officially entered the story, and once it shows up, it rarely leaves. As they fled the scene, they made a critical mistake. They were seen not just by anyone but a local minister, someone who recognized them, someone who knew exactly who they were. By the next day, it was over. They were arrested. Now here's where things take a turn that would shape the rest of Dillinger's life. Singleton pled not guilty, but Dillinger, he didn't fight it. His father, a respected deacon in the community, met with the prosecutor, Omar O'Haro, and afterward, he convinced his son to confess. To plead guilty, no lawyer or defense, just trust the system. And that decision would cost him everything. While Dillinger sat in jail, his life outside kept moving without him. His wife Beryl, the person who represented that brief glimpse of stability, filed for divorce. June 20th, 1929, it was finalized, and Dillinger would later admit that it broke him. Not just heartbreak in the romantic sense, but something deeper. It severed the last tie he had to a normal life, because after that there wasn't much to lose. And for someone like Dillinger, that's when things get dangerous. After trusting that maybe, just maybe, the system would show mercy, John Dillinger stood in a courtroom waiting to hear his future. He had been charged with assault and battery with intent to rob, conspiracy to commit a felony, serious charges, but still, this was just a $50 robbery, a first major offense. His father had done everything right, met with the prosecutor, encouraged honesty, pushed his son to take responsibility. So Dillinger expected probation, maybe a short sentence, something survivable. Instead, he was sentenced to 10 to 20 years in prison for $50. Even his father, a man who believed in discipline in the system and doing things the right way, was horrified. He told reporters he regretted ever telling his son to confess. He even begged the judge to reduce the sentence, but it didn't matter. The decision had already been made. And in that moment, something shifted, because it wasn't just punishment anymore. To Dillinger, it felt like betrayal. On the way back to Mooresville to testify against his accomplice, Dillinger did something that, in hindsight, feels almost inevitable. He tried to escape. For a brief moment, he broke free from his captors, freedom right there, and then gone. He was caught within minutes. It wasn't a successful escape, but it was telling, because now we're starting to see it clearly. Dillinger wasn't going to accept this quietly. Meanwhile, his accomplice, Ed Singleton, took a very different path. He pled not guilty, requested a change of venue, fought the system instead of trusting it, and his sentence, 2 to 4 years. Less time for the same crime. The lesson here wasn't lost on Dillinger. Singleton would later die in 1937, drunk, asleep on the railroad tracks. A chaotic end, but one that came after freedom, after life, after years Dillinger wouldn't get back. This is the part of the story that matters most. Not the robbery, not even the sentence, but what that sentence did. Because prison doesn't just take time, it reshapes people. And for Dillinger, those 10 to 20 years, they didn't scare him straight. They hardened him, educated him, connected him with men who knew crime not as desperation, but as a profession. The system thought it was punishing a criminal, and what it actually did was create one. Dillinger was sent to the Indiana Reformatory and later to the Indiana State Prison, and life there wasn't just hard, it was brutal. Even his intake physical tells a story. He was diagnosed with gonorrhea, and at the time, treatment wasn't simple. It was painful and invasive. Treatment often involved daily applications of remedies over several days, sometimes including the use of medicinal antiseptic coated sticks inserted into the urethra. Another layer of humiliation, another reason to feel stripped of control. And that resentment, it didn't fade, it grew, because every day he spent inside reinforced the same idea that the system hadn't just punished him, it had wronged him. But prison didn't just harden Dillinger, it trained him, because inside those walls, he met men who weren't guessing their way through crime. They were experts, men like Harry Pierpoint, Charles Mackley, Russell Clark, and Homer Van Meter. They weren't petty criminals, they were seasoned bank robbers, strategic, organized, precise, and they saw potential in Dillinger. So they taught him how to control a bank, how to control a room, how to move fast and disappear faster. Dillinger soaked it all in, not just the basics, but the philosophy. He even studied the system developed by Herman Lamb, a methodical, almost military approach to bank robbery. Every movement planned, every second accounted for. This wasn't desperation anymore, this was becoming a craft. While still behind bars, they started planning heist, targets, not if they got out, but when. Because for Dillinger, prison wasn't the end of his story. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Outside the prison walls, his father never gave up on him. He launched a public campaign for his release, gathered signatures, 188 people signed a petition asking for Dillinger to be given another chance. And eventually, it worked. On May 10th, 1933, after 9.5 years, Dillinger walked free. But timing matters because when he stepped back into the world, America was in the middle of a Great Depression. Jobs were scarce, banks were failing, people were desperate, and Dillinger, he had no real prospects. No clean slate waiting for him, no easy path forward. But he did have something else. A plan and a group of men waiting on the outside, ready to turn everything they'd learned into something real. And within weeks of his release, John Dillinger would return to crime. Only this time he wouldn't be improvising, he'd be ready. On June 21st, 1933, just over a month after walking out of prison, John Dillinger made good on everything he had learned. He walked into a bank in New Carlisle and walked out with $10,000, which was about $250,000 in today's money. Not $50, not a desperate grab for survival. This was different. This was clean, intentional, and controlled. And just like that, the plan he built in prison was no longer theory. By August 14th, he struck again. Another bank, this time in Bluffton. 2 robberies, 2 successes, and now law enforcement was paying attention. He was tracked from Dayton and captured shortly after. This could have been the end, a quick rise and even quicker fall, like he was taken to the jail in Lima. But police searched him and found something interesting, a document. Not money or weapons, a plan, an escape plan. When they demanded answers, Dillinger refused, but by then it didn't matter, because the plan was already in motion. Before his arrest, Dillinger had helped set everything up. A coordinated escape, not for himself, but for the men he'd met in prison. Guns were smuggled into their cells, and just 4 days after Dillinger was captured, they used them. They broke out, and the men who walked free, they weren't amateurs, they were the same men who trained Dillinger, including Harry Pierpont, Russell Clark, and Charles Mackley, along with others, Ed Schaus, Mary Copeland, and John Hamilton. Together, they found what would become known as the First Dillinger Gang. October 12th, 1933, the gang arrived in Lima. But they didn't come in guns blazing, they came in disguise, posing as officers from the Indiana State Police, calm, confident, and convincing. They told the sheriff, Jess Sarber, that they were there to extradite Dillinger, but Sarber had hesitated. He asked for credentials, and in that moment, the illusion shattered. Pierpoint pulled a gun and shot him. Sheriff Sarber died from the wound, and just like that, this wasn't robbery anymore. This was murder. After the shooting, they freed Dillinger. The four men fled back to Indiana and they reunited with the rest of the group. They weren't just criminals, they were organized, armed, and willing to kill. And Dillinger, he wasn't just part of it anymore, he was at the center of it. The man who once robbed a grocery store for $50 now had a gang, a system, and blood already attached to his name. And this is where John Dillinger stops being a mistake and becomes a movement. Dillinger is known to have participated with the Dillinger Gang in 12 bank robberies between June 21st, 1933 and June 30th, 1934. It is a popular adage that he refused to plan robberies in the town of Anderson, Indiana. It was a busy factory town that had an abundance of railroad tracks, and there was too great of a risk of getting stopped by a train and caught by authorities. Evelyn Billy Franchette met Dillinger in October 1933, and they began a relationship the following month. After Dillinger's death, Billy was offered money for her story and wrote a memoir for the Chicago Herald Examiner in August 1934. I'll be doing a short episode later this week on Evelyn because her life was so interesting and tragic. By early 1934, John Dillinger was no longer just a name whispered in police reports. He was a national headline. And on January 25th, 1934, his run finally caught up with him. He and his gang were captured in Tucson. For a moment, it looked like it was over. He was extradited back to Indiana, escorted by Matt Leach, and locked inside the jail in Crown Point. But this time, the stakes were different. He wasn't just facing robbery anymore. He was being held for the murder of William O'Malley, a police officer killed during a bank robbery in East Chicago. This wasn't something you walked away from. The local authorities were confident, actually more than confident. They told newspapers the jail was escape-proof. Extra guards were posted. Security was tightened. They wanted the world to know this time they had him. And if there's one thing that history loves, it's proving statements like that wrong. March 3rd, 1934, morning routine exercises, nothing unusual. And then everything changed. Somehow, Dillinger produced a gun inside an escape-proof jail. He caught the guards completely off guard, no warning, no struggle, and the most unbelievable part, he didn't fire a single shot. He simply walked out with 15 other inmates. Now here's where the story starts blurring into legend, because almost immediately people started asking, was the gun real? Some deputies swore it was, others weren't so sure. According to FBI accounts, Dillinger may have carved the pistol himself out of wood using a razor blade right there in his cell. A fake gun and a real escape. But then there's another version, one where the weapon wasn't carved at all, but smuggled in, possibly by his own attorney. And suddenly, the story isn't just about escape. It's about how far people are willing to go to help him succeed. Dillinger didn't just run after escaping. He stole a car and crossed state lines. And that was a mistake, because crossing state lines in a stolen vehicle made it a federal crime, which meant one thing. The Federal Bureau of Investigation was now officially involved. Up until this point, Dillinger had been a problem. Now he was a priority, a symbol, a man the government needed to stop, not just for justice, but for control. Because if someone could just walk out of an escape-proof jail, what else could they get away with? This wasn't just a manhunt, it was a pursuit, and it was about to end in a way that no one could ignore. Just days after the escape from Crown Point, the cracks started to show. On March 16th, one of the escapees, Herbert Youngblood, was tracked down in Port Huron. What followed was a shootout. Youngblood was killed, but not before the violence spread further. Deputy Sheriff Charles Kavanaugh was mortally wounded. Another life lost. Another reminder that this wasn't just about robbery anymore. Before Youngblood died, he told officers something explosive, that Dillinger was in Port Huron. Law enforcement flooded the area, searching, sweeping, and hunting, but it led nowhere. Because later, Youngblood walked it back, said he didn't actually know where Dillinger was, that they had split up shortly after the escape. Whether that was truth or a final act of loyalty, we'll never know. By now, this had gone beyond local law enforcement. A grand jury indicted John Dillinger, and the Bureau of Investigation, what would later become the FBI, launched a nationwide manhunt. Posters, descriptions, warnings. Dillinger wasn't just criminal anymore, he was a target. But even in the middle of all this chaos, Dillinger didn't just disappear completely. Just hours after escaping, he reunited with someone important, Billy Franchette. She wasn't part of the gang in the traditional sense, but she was part of his world, his anchor if he had one. They stayed together, moving quietly, eventually landing in Minneapolis at the Santa Monica apartments. For about 2 weeks, they lived there, hiding in plain sight. But Dillinger wasn't laying low for long. He met back up with John Hamilton and began assembling something even bigger. Not just his original crew, but something more volatile. He joined forces with the members of another gang, including the infamous babyface Nelson, along with Homer Van Meter, Tommy Carroll, and Eddie Green. This wasn't just a crew anymore, this was a network. More unpredictable, more aggressive, and more dangerous. And almost immediately, they got to work. Just 3 days after Dillinger's escape, they robbed a bank in Sioux Falls. Then, a week later, another hit, the First National Bank in Mason City. 2 robberies in 2 different states within days. This wasn't reckless, it was relentless. At this point, Dillinger wasn't just running, he was moving faster than the system could react. Different cities, different states, different gangs merging into one. And every move he made him harder to catch. But it also made one thing unavoidable, because the bigger he got, the more attention he drew, and the more attention he drew, the closer the end became. By March 20th, 1934, John Dillinger, Billy Franchette were on the move again. This time they landed in St. Paul. Not hiding in some remote cabin, not disappearing into the wilderness, they chose an apartment, the Lincoln Court Apartments, Apartment 303. And like seasoned fugitives, they didn't use their real name. They signed in as Mr. and Mrs. Carl T. Hellman, blending in and keeping quiet like any other couple. But there was a problem. They weren't as invisible as they thought. The landlord, Daisy Coffey, noticed them, and not just in passing, she watched them closely. Night after night, something about them felt off. So on March 30th, she did something simple but incredibly important. She went to the FBI office in St. Paul and she reported them. Not just their presence, but details including their car, and just like that, the clock started ticking. The tip was enough. Soon, federal agents were watching the building. 2 of them, Rufus Coulter and Rusty Knowles. But here's the thing about surveillance. Sometimes you see nothing. The blinds stayed shut, no movement, no obvious signs from the outside. It looked like an empty apartment. But inside, one of the most wanted men in America was sitting just feet away. The next morning, around 10:15 a.m., Agent Knowles began circling the block, looking for anything. He parked nearby, watching, waiting. Meanwhile, Coulter and a local detective, Henry Cummings, entered the building. 10 minutes passed, and then something changed. A car pulled up, a green Ford coupe. Behind the wheel was Homer Van Meter, which meant one thing. This wasn't just a hiding place anymore. The gang was gathering. At this point, law enforcement didn't just have a suspect. They had a location, a pattern, a connection. And Dillinger, he had no idea how close they were. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment isn't when you're running, it's when you think you're safe inside apartment 303. Everything was still. Outside, the net was tightening. Federal agent Rufus Coulter and Detective Henry Cummings stood at the door. They knocked, and on the other side, Billy Franchette answered, but only just a crack. The door, maybe 2 or 3 inches, said she wasn't dressed and told them to come back later. And right there, that tiny moment could have changed everything. But instead of forcing the issue, they waited. 2 minutes passed, maybe 3. Coulter stepped away briefly, went downstairs to call it in, then came back and they waited again. And that's when the situation shifted. A man appeared in the hallway, and it was Homer Van Meter. He looked at Coulter and asked, "Are you Johnson?" Coulter said no, and instead of stopping him, he let him walk past. But something didn't sit right, so Coulter asked, "Who are you?" Van Meter asked, "I'm a soap salesman." No samples, no credentials, just a story. And then he kept walking. Coulter waited 10 seconds, maybe 20, then he followed. As soon as he reached the lobby, everything exploded. Van Meter turned and opened fire. Shots echoed through the building. Coulter ran, bursting out the door, with Van Meter chasing him. Then suddenly Van Meter turned and ran back inside. Outside Agent Rusty Knowles realized what was happening. He pointed out the Ford coupe, Van Meter's car. Coulter raised his weapon and shot out the tire. But it wasn't enough. Van Meter escaped anyway, jumping onto a passing coal truck and disappearing into the city. But inside the building, things were just getting started. Back upstairs, Franchette rushed to warn John Dillinger. Police were there and then gunfire. Van Meter's shots echoed through the building, and Dillinger reacted instantly. He grabbed a Thompson machine gun and opened fire through the door. Bullets tore through the hallway, forcing Cummings to dive for cover. Dillinger stepped out and fired again. Cummings fired back with a revolver, 5 shots total. One of them hit Dillinger. He was struck in the left calf, but it didn't stop him. Cummings ran out of ammunition and had no choice but to retreat down the stairs and out the building. And just like that, the moment passed. Dillinger, wounded but still moving, grabbed Franchette. They ran down the stairs, out the back, and got into their Hudson and drove away. Another close call, another escape, another reminder that catching Dillinger wasn't going to be simple. Think about how close that was. Agents at the door, a conversation in the hallway, a few seconds of hesitation, and still he got away. But something had changed. He was injured, exposed, and seen, and every escape like this was getting narrower. After being shot, John Dillinger didn't run far because he couldn't. He was wounded, bleeding, and now he needed help. Dillinger and Billy Franchette made their way to an apartment in Minneapolis, belonging to one of his associates, Eddie Green. From there, a call was made to a man who operated in the shadows, Clayton E. May. Not the kind of doctor you find in a hospital, the kind who treated people who couldn't afford to be seen. Dillinger was taken to a hidden apartment run by a woman named Augusta Salt, where patients came when discretion mattered more than legality. And there, Dr. May treated the wound. No hospital records, no official reports, just antiseptics and silence. He was promised $500 for his work, but he never saw a dime. While Dillinger recovered, the world outside kept moving. On April 2nd, just hours after visiting him, Eddie Green was shot by federal agents in St. Paul and was mortally wounded. Another associate gone, another piece of the network collapsing. By April 4th, he was well enough to move, so he did something unexpected. He went home back to Morrisville, back to his family. After everything, the robberies, the killings, the manhunt, he sat down and visited, called relatives, spent time with his half-brother, Hubert. For a moment, it almost looked normal. But normal doesn't last long in this story. On April 7th, in the early morning hours, everything went wrong again. Driving near Noblesville, Hubert fell asleep at the wheel. The car veered off the road, crashing through a fence and slamming into the woods. Inside the wreckage, maps, a machine gun, magazine, rope, and a bullwhip. Not exactly the contents of a peaceful family trip. According to Hubert, Dillinger had plans for that whip, a visit to a former lawyer, a man he believed had cheated him. Even in hiding, he wasn't letting things go. Later that same weekend, something almost surreal happened. The Dillinger family had a picnic out in the open, and just beyond them, watching from a distance, were federal agents, J.L. Garrity and T.J. Donegan, close enough to see, not close enough to act. Imagine that, sitting with your family, knowing, or at least suspecting, you're being watched. Eventually, the group split up. Billy Franchette drove off in a newly purchased Ford V8 with 2 of Dillinger's nieces in the car. In Dillinger, he was there lying on the floor of the vehicle, hidden in plain sight. Agents saw the car but looked right at it, but they didn't recognize him. From there, the road led to Chicago, the city that would become the final stage of his history. Because now everything was tightening. His gang was shrinking, his allies were dying, the FBI was getting closer, and every move he made was bringing him one step near to the end. He just didn't know it yet. By April 9th, 1934, John Dillinger was running out of time, whether he realized it or not. That afternoon, he had arranged to meet Billy Franchette at a tavern in Chicago, but something felt off. Billy sensed it, and she went in first. The moment she stepped inside, it was over. Federal agents were watching, and she was arrested immediately. But she didn't talk, even under pressure. She refused to give up Dillinger's location. Outside, Dillinger sat in his car, waiting unaware, and then he drove away. They never saw each other again. That loss hit him hard, not just because she was gone, but because she represented something he didn't have anymore: trust, connection, a life outside the chaos. He became despondent, unfocused. For the first time, you start to see cracks in the control that he had built. The gang tried to steady him, tried to keep him focused, but Homer Van Meter pushed him in a different direction. If they couldn't hide, they could prepare. More weapons, more protection, and so they escalated. Later that week, Dillinger and Van Meter kidnapped a police officer, Judd Pitteger. They forced him at gunpoint into a police station, not to turn themselves in, but to rob it. They took guns, bulletproof vests, then disappeared again. Days later, they were hiding out at a remote lodge in Manitowish waters, a quiet place, isolated. It was called Little Bohemia, and for a moment, it probably felt safe until it wasn't. The Bureau got a tip, and on April 22nd, they moved in. But the raid didn't go as planned. Gunfire erupted, agents scrambled for cover, and once again, Dillinger did what he always seemed to do. He escaped out back into the dark and was gone. By July 1934, Dillinger vanished. No sightings, no confirmed locations. To the outside world, he was gone. But in reality, he was hiding in plain sight. Back in Chicago, using a new name, Jimmy Lawrence, working a normal job, living a quiet life. And in a city that big, he almost pulled it off. But the FBI, they weren't guessing anymore when they found his abandoned getaway car blood-stained on Chicago Street. They knew he was there, somewhere in the city, watching, waiting, and hiding. And this time, they weren't going to miss him. By the spring of 1934, John Dillinger understood something most fugitives learn too late. Running isn't enough. When the whole country knows your face, he decided to do something drastic. He was going to change it. As early as March, Dillinger had been asking about plastic surgery. Not vanity, but survival. Through his attorney, Louis Pickett, he was introduced to a man who lived in the shadows, William Losser, a disgraced doctor convicted under narcotics laws, recently out of prison. Exactly the kind of person you trust when you can't go to a real hospital. The price? $5,000. A small fortune at the time, but for Dillinger, his face was well worth the money. The surgery didn't happen in a clinic. It took place in a private home belonging to an elderly man named James Probasco, hidden, unregulated, and dangerous. On May 28th, the procedure began. Dillinger chose general anesthesia, and almost immediately something went wrong. Too much ether, he stopped breathing and turned blue. For a moment, it looked like John Dillinger had survived everything just to die on a table. But Losser reacted fast. He forced Dillinger's airways open, dragged his tongue forward, and forced his chest to expand. And just barely, Dillinger gasped back to life. And then they kept going. Without proper anesthesia, Losser continued, cutting, sewing, and altering, removing moles from his forehead, reshaping parts of his nose, cutting into his chin, pulling back the skin of his cheeks. Piece by piece, the face people recognized were being erased. But that wasn't enough, because Dillinger didn't just want to change how he looked, he wanted to erase who he was, including his fingerprints. So Losser used something even more extreme: a chemical mixture, nitric acid and hydrochloric acid, strong enough to dissolve metal, applied directly to his fingertips, burning away the ridges that made him unidentifiable. It didn't completely work, but the damage was permanent. Think about what this says. Dillinger wasn't just hiding anymore, he was dismantling himself. changing his face, destroying his fingerprints, risking death just to stay free. Because by now he knew the walls were closing in, and no matter what he did, no matter how much he changed, there was one thing he couldn't escape: recognition. Because somewhere out there, someone would always know who he was. After everything, the surgery, the risk, the attempt to erase himself, John Dillinger wasn't satisfied. Not even close. According to Art O'Leary, Dillinger didn't like the results. The face he got wasn't the one he wanted. The people around him started to notice something else too. Something shifted. James Probasco, the man who had let Dillinger use his home, became increasingly uneasy, afraid even. He described Dillinger as restless, unpredictable, always going out for walks, always moving, and to Probasco, that wasn't just strange, it was dangerous, because every unnecessary move, every extra risk, made it more likely the authorities would find them. At one point, he said it plainly. He was afraid to have Dillinger around. By July, the investigation was catching up. Authorities weren't just looking for Dillinger anymore, they were tracing the people who had helped him: the doctors, the associates, the places he'd hidden. On July 24th, William Losser was arrested in Oak Park, and suddenly everything connected to that surgery was exposed. News spread fast, and people started running. Art O'Leary fled Chicago almost immediately, trying to stay ahead of what was coming, but it didn't last. By August, he was arrested too. And then things took an even darker turn. Just days after Losser's arrest, James Probasco fell from the 19th floor of a building in Chicago while in custody, a fall that ended his life. Whether it was suicide, fear, or something else entirely, we really don't know. Then came another loss. On August 23rd, Homer Van Meter, one of Dillinger's closest allies, was cornered in St. Paul, trapped in a dead end alley. No escape this time, police opened fire and Van Meter was killed. Another piece of the gang gone. By now, look at what's happened. His girlfriend's gone, his allies are dead or arrested, his safe houses are compromised, his identity damaged but not erased. And Dillinger, alone, still running but with fewer places to go, fewer people to trust, and fewer chances left. Because at this point, this story isn't building anymore, it's collapsing. And when everything around someone falls apart like this, there's only one place left for it to go: the end. By the summer of 1934, John Dillinger was hiding in plain sight in Chicago under his new name still by Jimmy Lawrence, working and still trying to blend in. And that's when he met Polly Hamilton, a waitress, a familiar face, and ironically, someone who resembled Billy Franchette. Maybe that wasn't an accident. They met at a nightclub, talked, connected, and soon they were spending time together. But Polly didn't come alone. Because in her world there was someone else, a woman with her own story, her own motives, Anna Kamanis, also known as Anna Sage, also known as the Woman in Red. Anna had a problem. She was facing deportation, and she needed a way out, so she made a deal. She contacted the Federal Bureau of Investigation and offered them something priceless: John Dillinger. In exchange, she wanted to stay in the country, and the FBI agreed. On July 22nd, 1934, everything fell into place. Dillinger asked Anna if she wanted to join them for a movie, just a normal evening, nothing suspicious. But Anna already had a plan. She needed to alert the agents without raising suspicion. So she created an excuse. She said she needed butter to cook fried chicken, and somewhere between the grocery shelf and the checkout line, she made the call. She told agents exactly where Dillinger would be. That night at the Biograph Theater, the FBI moved fast. They weren't taking chances this time. Teams were deployed across the city. One group went to another theater just in case. But the main focus, the Biograph. They surrounded it, watched, and waited. And to make sure they didn't miss her, Anna agreed to wear a bright dress. Not red exactly, more orange, but bright enough to stand out, bright enough to mark the moment everything would end. That evening, Dillinger walked into the theater, no mask, no disguise strong enough to hide him completely. Just another man going to see a movie, sitting in the dark, watching the screen, unaware that outside dozens of agents were waiting for the lights to come back on, waiting for him to step into the open. One of the agents waiting and watching was Melvin Purvis. When the movie ended, the doors opened. Crowds spilled out onto the street, and Purvis gave the signal. He lit a cigar. Simple and subtle. Dillinger stepped out. Accounts say he glanced towards the agent. Maybe he sensed something, maybe not. But in that moment, everything slowed. He moved ahead of the women, reached into his pocket, trying to pull his gun, but he didn't make it. Agents shouted, closed in, and then gunfire. 3 men pursued him into a nearby alley. Clarence Hurt, Charles Winstead, and Herman Hollis. Shots rang out. Dillinger was hit. Once, twice, again, until the final bullet entered the back of his neck, severing his spinal cord and ended it. He fell face first into the alley, and just like that, it was over. An ambulance was called, but it didn't matter. He was gone, 31 years old, and according to investigators, he never said a word. But the story didn't end there, because what happened next was something else entirely. Crowds gathered, not quietly, not respectfully, but frantically. People rushed towards the body, dipping handkerchiefs into his blood, using newspapers as souvenirs, as if they were collecting a piece of a legend. His body was placed on display at the morgue, and over the next day and a half, over 15,000 people came to see him, staring, studying, looking at the man who had become, for a time, bigger than the law itself. John Dillinger didn't die in a bank vault. He didn't go out in a blaze of glory during a robbery. He died in an alley after a movie, being betrayed by Anna Sage, who, by the way, was still deported shortly after back to Romania. So it was all for nothing. And maybe that's the real story here, because no matter how fast you run, how much you change, or how many times you escape, eventually the bill comes due. For today's meal, I really liked everything that I made. I had never had a homemade Salisbury steak, and safe to say I'll definitely be making that again. And not to mention, like, the hand pies were really good as well. If you guys liked this episode, please like and subscribe, and I will see you guys on the next one. Bye.